welcome to this video about my Ford Model T. I'm currently actually on the way to France, which is cool. Another 2 weeks of quarantine when I get back, which is not so cool. So what have I been doing on the Ford? Well, essentially I managed to get her running, I managed to get her registered, and I took her for a nice little drive around the block. So I had to do a few little jobs to get her ready for the road. One of them was I fitted some seat belts, so I made a nice little bit of stainless steel angle, and I actually got some aircraft seat belts from, I think they've probably come from something like a 737 from one of the aircraft scrap places. I also sorted out the running boards, cut them down to a good size and welded up the ends. By the way, I used old running boards that were already really rusted. I didn't want to wreck my really good condition new running boards. I don't know what I'm going to do with those. I haven't had a good think yet. Another thing I managed to do is I managed to source some demountable wheels from someone that had actually been nicely renovated like that. And I got some good wheel bearings for them. Originally the Ford Model T had like ball bearings that you could take out and clean up and put back in. But then people started using these taper bearings, which are just a lot more reliable, and it's a pretty good setup, that. So with all the wheels fitted and greased up, I'm just here doing my final preparations. I stuck the number plates on using some DVLA clips, which seemed a pretty easy way of attaching them, and they're nice and secure. Just made them up out of a bit of aluminium and painted them black and got some letters to stick on them. It'll do for now. Also at this point I had to make sure that I'd done all the nuts and bolts up. I replaced all the shackles and made sure that everything's safe, because in the UK, because she's such an old car, she doesn't need any sort of roadworthiness certificate or anything like that, or any checks. But obviously if I had something go wrong and it was my fault and I hadn't, properly maintained the vehicle, I'd be in trouble. So I wanted to make sure everything was nice and tight and ready. So with all that done, it was time to get her running and take her out. At this time, with nice new valves installed and the coils all sort of tuned up a bit better, my technique of starting her, well, my technique is still pretty bad, but she's starting to start a lot easier. Only takes a couple of turns and I can get her running. At this point, I have to admit that I was feeling some trepidation, because the controls on the Model T Ford, they are a little bit unusual. And of course your mind always goes back to how you would normally drive a car, so in other words you've got your accelerator pedal, your clutch pedal and your brake pedal, whereas on the Model T you've got a high-low gear, a reverse pedal and a brake pedal, and the brakes aren't that great. So yeah, it's not difficult to drive, it's just you worry about reverting. Being on the left, on the wrong side of the car driving, because we in the UK drive on the right side, actually doesn't bother me very much, because I've driven quite a bit in Europe, both in European cars, which drive on the other side, and in UK cars on the wrong side of the road. Although it has to be said that, yeah, if you get it wrong, the consequences can be quite severe, as I'm afraid I once found out in France a few years ago. So I then took her to a nice little sort of side road up near a school. No kids around at this time because it's weekend. And thought I'd just test her up and down and just give her some decent runs. Then I got back and I found on my drive that I had a few sort of niggling issues, like for example the brakes are not working particularly well. It's more than a niggling issue. But having said, you've got an emergency brake and that works fine, and the foot brake was sort of working. A slight side note here is that I've bought these AC accessory brakes to stick on the drums there, which should make everything a bit better. I decided to adjust the foot brake because I thought that the bands, it has in the Ford Model T's transmission, it has this drum and this sort of band that comes across and clamps the drum, and I took the cover off and I adjusted it a bit. And then I thought also I'd had a slight issue with the clutch on the high gear. You'd sort of drop it in and it seemed to slip a lot. So on the Ford Model T there's 3 fingers that sort of hold the clutch in place, and when you drop it in, depending on where they're set, it sort of adjusts it, not quite. I mean, really it's the spring. There's a spring that pushes on the clutch plates as well, that's released. Anyhow, so I thought I'd try and adjust the fingers and just see how they were. So I got a bolt that was 13/16 head on it, leant over, stuck it in between the spring and the it goes in a little place between the spring and the where the fingers act on in the clutch, and dropped it. After all the forum talk that they had saying do not drop anything in the transmission, it was really stupid. I don't know how I did it, because I was so aware of it as well. So I should have tied it up with dental floss, as people say, and I didn't. Turns out it's actually a good thing. Even though I spent about 3 or 4 hours trying to fish the blimmin' bolt out, it meant I had to take the hogshead off because I couldn't get it out. So I grabbed the hogshead off, which was not as difficult as I thought it would be. It was actually quite easy. And I looked, and on my magneto, there was a plate hanging off. There was a plate jammed down the side of the engine. So on the magneto, the magnets are held in place by like a brass screw and a steel plate. And apparently the brass screw can crystallize or something, I don't know what they said, but anyhow it wears after a time. Sometimes it can snap off. And that had obviously happened on 3 plates. So I haven't seen any ill effects of this. I can't see anything wrong with the gears or the flywheel or anything. And it's a simple, nice brass screw, and they're about 90p each or something like that. So you think that's no problem. The only problem is to put them in, the magneto's in the way. The magneto coils are fixed to the engine. And the only way to do it is take the engine out, drop off the bottom of the engine, and split the transmission from the engine, which is a fair amount of work. So what I'm going to do at the same time is, because it's only 3 bearing caps, 3 main bearings on the engine, I will take the crankshaft out at the same time, because I was going to take the con rods off anyway, because I wanted to put these little oil dippers in that dip oil and throw it around the engine. It's a little modern modification that's quite cool. So I'm going to take that crankshaft out, and I'm going to get it Magnaflux tested for cracks, because it might have one. I also found that my 4th main bearing at the back of the gearbox was really, really bad. So that's one of the reasons I want to test a crank for cracks, and I also want to test the transmission shaft as well. And then I'll stick everything back together again, get a new 4th main bearing at the end, and stick her in. But because I've got to go through all of this, I might as well strip the whole car apart, get the chassis shot blasted, paint it all up, and then reassemble all of that, because I've tested pretty much everything. I know it sort of works. I've drilled the holes that I need to drill, just about. So it's really time, I think, to get the chassis done, because then when the engine goes in, it will be painted. And when the radiator goes on, I can get everything together and know that I'm not going to have to strip it all apart again, which, I've drained the fluid out, the water out of the radiator 3 or 4 times now. I've done the oil a couple of times, or you have to do the oil a lot anyhow. But I seem to be taking stuff apart and putting them back together again. I'm getting a bit sick of it. I know I'm at the point where this time it should go back together and stay together. I've just jinxed it, so now I'm going to have to take it apart again. I know. Life does that to you. Anyhow, so that's my plan. I was noticing I had like a tight binding spot every 180 degrees.